The morning her father sold her, Claire Ellington was at her desk balancing someone else's quarterly reports, completely unaware that her entire future had already been signed away. She got the call at 11:14 a.m., not from her father, from a stranger with a voice like gravel dragged across concrete. "Miss Ellington, your presence is required at Bellarosa, tonight, 8 o'clock. A pause. "Don't be late. Mr. Moretti doesn't reschedule." She hung up and sat very still for 47 seconds, staring at a spreadsheet she could no longer read. Moretti. Even someone who spent her entire life avoiding the news had heard that name. If you're watching this story right now, if something in these first few seconds already made your chest tighten, then you already understand what it means to sacrifice everything for someone who never deserved it. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens to Claire is the kind of story that doesn't let you go. If this moved you even slightly, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The stories coming after this one are even more devastating. You don't want to miss them. So, the first thing Claire did after hanging up the phone was open her bathroom cabinet and stare at her reflection for a long time. She was 31 years old. She had good cheekbones, her mother's dark eyes, and the kind of face that men tended to look at twice on ordinary days. None of that felt like an asset right now. Right now, it felt like a liability. Her father had called 3 days earlier, crying the way he only cried when the situation had moved beyond embarrassing into genuinely catastrophic. Gambling debts, he said, $200,000. Owed to people who did not send polite notices in the mail. He'd arranged a dinner, he said, just a dinner, with the son of the man he owed. A chance to make introductions, establish goodwill, maybe buy some time. "You won't have to do anything," he promised. "Just show up. Just smile." Claire had been bailing her father out of trouble since she was 19 years old. She had drained her savings twice. She had co-signed loans she'd spent years regretting. She had picked him up from casino parking lots at 3 in the morning more times than she could count. She understood, with the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been giving and giving until there's almost nothing left, exactly what "just show up" meant when her father said it. It meant, save me again. But this time was different. This time the name attached to the debt was Moretti. So Claire stood in front of her bathroom mirror and made a decision. She was not going to walk into that restaurant looking like herself. What? The transformation took 3 hours and a specific kind of creativity that only desperation produces. She found the mustard yellow turtleneck at the back of her closet, a thing she'd bought at a thrift store years ago for a Halloween costume she'd never worn. It was the color of old margarine, and it fit her like a sleeping bag. She layered a brown cardigan over it, the kind with pills on the elbows and a broken button at the collar. She spent 20 minutes working cooking oil through her hair until it sat against her scalp in flat, greasy stripes. She drew a faint unibrow across the bridge of her nose with an eyebrow pencil, tested it in the mirror, and decided it was exactly wrong enough to work. Then she rubbed the cut end of a raw onion across both wrists. She stood back and looked at herself. The woman in the mirror looked like someone having a very bad year. That was the point. The logic was simple. If she could make herself repellent enough, unattractive enough, difficult enough in a single dinner, then whatever heir or son or associate had been arranged for this meeting would walk away disgusted. The debt arrangement would fall apart. Her father's problem would remain her father's problem, where it belonged, and Claire could go back to her apartment and her spreadsheets and her quiet, careful, ordinary life. It was not a sophisticated plan, but it was the only one she had. She squeaked out of her apartment in orthopedic shoes at 7:20 p.m. and caught a cab to Midtown. Bellarosa on a Tuesday night was the kind of place that made you feel poor just by walking through the door. Crystal everywhere, warm amber lighting. Tables spread far enough apart that conversation stayed private, which was probably the entire point. The maitre d' looked at Claire the way people look at something that has crawled out from under a rock, but he had clearly been trained to conceal that reaction because he recovered within a single blink and led her across the dining room without comment. She could feel every set of eyes in the room tracking her. Good. That was exactly what she wanted. The orthopedic shoes squeaked with every step. She let them. Table 7 was in the back, slightly separated from the rest of the dining room by a low partition. Claire had expected someone her age or younger, someone polished and impatient, the kind of man who checked his phone during dinner and considered it a compliment to tell a woman she was pretty, the kind of man who could be driven away with 20 minutes of aggressive bad table manners. What she found at table 7 was not that. The man sitting there was somewhere in his late 30s. He was built like someone who had spent a long time doing work that required physical force, not gym vanity. Wide through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, the kind of muscle that doesn't taper or pose. He wore a charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, which revealed forearms mapped with old ink and older scars. His face had been broken at least once. The nose sat slightly off-center, and there was a faint ridge along one cheekbone that didn't come from birth. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her. Not with surprise, not with disgust, not with the polite discomfort she'd expected and prepared for. He was looking at her the way an experienced card player looks at a hand they've already decided how to play. Claire's plan, which had felt solid an hour ago, began to feel the way ice feels in April. She sat down anyway. She had come this far. "You're not who I expected," she said, mostly to fill the silence. The man across from her didn't answer immediately. He watched her settle into the chair. He watched her knock her napkin onto the floor on purpose and leave it there. He watched her pick up the breadbasket, examine a roll with apparent suspicion, and put it back without taking any. "Neither are you," he said. His voice was low. Not theatrical about it, just low, the way a room gets quiet when a door shuts at the end of a hallway. "I'm Claire Ellington." She said it the way someone announces a minor inconvenience. "I know who you are." "Then you know I'm here because my father—" "I know why you're here," he said. "I know why your father arranged this dinner. I also know why you've rubbed something unpleasant on your wrists and drawn that line across your face." He picked up his water glass. "The shoes are a nice touch. Where did you find those?" Claire felt the floor shift slightly under her. She had underestimated him. That was already clear. She hadn't entirely understood how much until that moment, when he named every element of her disguise without blinking, and the only emotion on his face was something that looked uncomfortably close to respect. She leaned forward and breathed directly at him. He didn't flinch. "You're wasting your time," he said. "And mine." He set down his water glass. "But you already know that, which is why you're working harder than you need to." "Where is Victor Rains?" she demanded. Victor Rains was the name her father had given her, the name she'd prepared for. This was supposed to be dinner with Victor Rains. The man across from her was quiet for a moment. "Victor Rains is in a private hospital in New Jersey," he said. "He'll be there for some time. Bilateral knee fractures require considerable recovery." Claire stared at him. "There was a disagreement," the man said, with no particular emphasis, "about missing inventory." "Who are you?" He held out one hand across the table. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just a straightforward introduction. "Adrian Moretti Avant." The name landed in Claire's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had heard it the way everyone in New York heard it, in fragments, in whispers, attached to things that happened to people who borrowed money they couldn't return, or who crossed supply lines they didn't own, or who simply disappeared from neighborhoods where they'd been fixtures for decades. Moretti wasn't the flashy kind of dangerous. He wasn't in the tabloids. He didn't show up at charity events with models on his arm and a publicist managing his image. He was the kind of dangerous that didn't need to be publicized, and he was sitting across from her in a restaurant, patient as a man with nowhere else to be, watching her absorb the information. "My father owed someone money," Claire said carefully. "He arranged a dinner with the creditor's son. That's what I was told." "That's what he told you." "You're not Victor Rains' father." "No." "Then what exactly is happening right now?" Adrian unfolded his hands on the table. "Victor Rains was the intermediary. His father's organization was one of several that your father cycled debts through over the past 6 years. When Rains' organization failed to collect, because your father is exceptionally good at avoiding consequences, the debts were consolidated." A pause. "I now hold them. All of them. Every dollar." Claire looked down at her hands. She had planned for an uncomfortable dinner. She had planned for a young heir with wandering eyes and an overestimated opinion of himself. She had packed every available tool of social repulsion into 3 hours of preparation. She had not planned for this. "I want to go home," she said. "You can." Adrian didn't move. "But I'd like you to hear something first. I'm not interested in payment arrangements. I've been cleaning up after my father's debt since I was 20 years old, and I'm done. I'm not responsible for what he borrowed." "No," Adrian agreed. "Legally, you're right." Something in the way he said legally made her stop. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a single folder. He placed it on the table between them and opened it with one hand. The pages inside were standard contract paper, dense with legal language, notarized at the bottom. The signature at the bottom of the page was hers. It was not her signature, but it was hers. The world contracted to the size of that page. Claire picked it up. She read it once. She read it again. The third time she read it, she understood what her father had done, and she set the paper back down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile when you're trying not to let anyone see that your hands are shaking. Her father had borrowed money against her identity, not her credit score, not a financial guarantee, her legal identity. Her name, her professional credentials, her signature as a licensed accountant, pledged as collateral against his gambling debts without her knowledge, without her consent, with a forgery so competent it had already passed 2 rounds of legal review. If the contract was enforced, Claire, not her father, was legally responsible for $200,000 borrowed from one of the most dangerous private creditors in New York. "He didn't tell you," Adrian said. Not as a question, she couldn't make herself answer. "I assumed he hadn't." The restaurant moved on around them. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at a table near the front. A waiter glided past with a tray of desserts that looked expensive and completely irrelevant to anything happening in Claire's body right now. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Adrian leaned forward slightly. "I want an auditor stout." The explanation was precise, and it was not what she expected. The man who had built the financial architecture of his organization over the previous decade, Adrian told her, had been systematically stealing from it for at least 4 years. Shell companies, fake vendors, fraudulent contracts layered inside legitimate shipping manifests. The theft was elegant and patient, the kind of fraud that only works when the person committing it understands the system better than anyone watching it. Adrian had identified the problem. He had dealt with the person responsible. But the organization he'd inherited, a network of shipping operations, warehousing contracts, and legitimate construction investments, was still running on corrupted books. He needed someone who could separate the real from the fabricated, someone whose entire professional identity depended on accuracy, someone who had never touched organized crime. "I'm not helping you launder money," Claire said immediately. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not helping you hide assets. I'm not asking for that either." "Then what exactly—" "I'm asking you to tell me the truth," Adrian said, "about my own books, about what's real and what isn't." His eyes hadn't left her face. "You've been doing that your entire career. The only difference is the client." "The difference," Claire said, "is everything." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across and placed one finger on the forged contract. "You have a choice," he said. "You can walk out of here tonight and spend the next several years fighting this in court while my attorneys make your professional life very difficult." He removed his finger. "Or you can spend the next 90 days telling me what my accountant stole from me and walk away when it's finished with no debt, no legal complications, and your name completely cleared." Claire stared at him. "You can't clear my name. You can't make a forged document disappear." "I can make everything that document represents disappear," he said. "I've done more complicated things before breakfast." She believed him. That was the worst part. She sat in a restaurant smelling faintly of raw onion with a fake unibrow drawn across her face, and she believed every word Adrian Moretti said because he said each one exactly once and didn't bother ornamenting any of them. "I want to think about it," she said. "Of course." He reached across the table without asking permission, and with the unhurried precision of someone diffusing something delicate, used his thumb to smudge the pencil line she'd drawn across her nose. "You've been hiding from the wrong person," he said quietly. "I already know exactly who you are." Claire sat very still. And who do you think that is? He looked at her with those flat, patient black eyes. Someone who's been holding everything together so long she's forgotten how to put it down. She had no answer for that. She had no disguise for that. She sat in her mustard turtleneck and her grease-slicked hair and felt more exposed than she had at any point in the evening, because the truth was that no one, not one person in her adult life, had ever said anything that accurate about her without her telling them first. Adrian signaled for the check. "Take the night," he said. "I'll have someone contact you in the morning." He left before she did, walking out of Bellarosa without looking back, and Claire sat alone at table 7 for 7 minutes staring at the forged contract. She thought about fighting it. She had thought about fighting every debt her father had created, and she had never once won. She thought about running, and understood immediately that you didn't run from men like Adrian Moretti, because there was nowhere in this city his reach didn't extend. She thought about what he'd said. Someone who's been holding everything together so long, she's forgotten how to put it down. She folded the contract. She put it in her bag. She stood up, squeaking faintly in her orthopedic shoes, and walked out into the cold New York night. She told herself she hadn't decided anything yet. She was already lying to herself. Monday morning, she stood outside a warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront at 7:55 a.m., wearing her actual clothes for the first time in days. Dark slacks, a gray blazer, her good leather flats. Her hair was clean, the unibrow was gone. She looked like herself. She had almost forgotten what that felt like. A man named Rowan, broad-shouldered and economical with words, met her at the loading dock and took her upstairs to a glass-walled office overlooking the warehouse floor. Below, forklifts moved cargo in patterns that looked chaotic until you watched long enough to understand there was a system running underneath. Above, the office held 3 workstations, a conference table, and approximately 11 years' worth of financial records organized in a way that told her immediately that the person who'd arranged them had been very, very good at making things difficult to find. Adrian arrived 12 minutes after she did. No ceremony, no welcome speech. He put a hard drive on the table in front of her. "Start there," he said. "What's on it?" "Everything my previous CFO didn't want me to see." Claire sat down, plugged in the drive, and started reading. Within 40 minutes, she found the first shell company. Within 2 hours, she found 3 more. By noon, she had mapped the first layer of a financial architecture so deliberately constructed that it had the queasy beauty of a very complex lie, one that required its creator to remember hundreds of smaller lies in order to sustain it. There were vendors who didn't exist, maintenance contracts paid to companies with no employees, shipping invoices for cargo that manifested nowhere in the physical records. She looked up from the screen. Adrian was standing in the doorway of the office, watching her. "How bad?" he said. "How long did you trust him?" 11 years. Claire looked back at the screen. "It's bad," she said. Adrian nodded once. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man absorbing a confirmation of something he'd already known and had been simply waiting to hear named out loud. "Can you untangle it?" She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about problems. Not from the answer backward, but from the beginning forward, following each thread to its source. "Yes," she said. "How long?" "Longer than 90 days, she said. "This is his 4 years of deliberate obfuscation by someone who understood every system he was hiding inside. You're not going to like some of what I find." "I don't need to like it," Adrian said. "I need it to be true." Claire looked at him across the office, through the glass that separated them from the organized noise of the warehouse floor below. She had walked into Bellarosa 3 days ago wearing raw onion and orthopedic shoes, trying to make a man decide she wasn't worth his time. She was sitting inside his operation now, dismantling the fraud buried in his books. And the terrifying part, the part she hadn't been prepared for, was that for the first time in years, the work in front of her felt like the truest thing she'd been asked to do. She turned back to the screen. "Then let me work," she said. 3 weeks into the job, Claire stopped counting the hours she spent in that glass office. She started counting exits instead. It wasn't something she decided consciously. It was the kind of habit that grows in people who spend enough time in places where the rules are different, where the man who signs your checks also decides what happens to people who disappoint him, and where the line between employee and liability is thinner than any contract she'd ever audited. Every morning she noted the stairwell at the north end of the building, the freight elevator that opened onto the loading dock, the gap in the fence along the eastern perimeter where the chain link had pulled away from its post and nobody had fixed it. She never used any of them. That bothered her more than the exits themselves. The work was the problem, or more precisely, the work was the only thing keeping her sane, and that was its own kind of problem. Because the books Adrian had handed her were genuinely extraordinary. Not in the way she would have used that word at her old accounting firm, where extraordinary meant a particularly clean tax structure or an elegantly handled depreciation schedule. These were extraordinary the way a recovered crime scene is extraordinary, in the precision of the damage, in the patience required to inflict it, in the almost surgical understanding of how institutions trust themselves. The previous CFO's name was Augustus Hale. She knew that from the signature blocks on 11 years of internal documents. She had never met him, and from what Rowan had told her in 3 words or fewer, "He's not available," she understood she never would. What Augustus Hale had done to Adrian Moretti's books was the financial equivalent of dry rot. From the outside, the structure looked load-bearing. From the inside, the supports had been quietly hollowed for years. Claire found the second layer of shell companies on a Wednesday, the same day she discovered that one of the largest fake vendors, a maintenance company called Ridgeline Facilities LLC, had been paid nearly $2 million over 4 years for work that had never been performed on buildings that didn't require it. She cross-referenced the payments against the physical maintenance logs, then against the building permits, then against the insurance records, and built a grid on her whiteboard that showed, very clearly, exactly where each dollar had gone. She was still staring at the grid at 7:40 p.m. when Adrian walked in. He looked at the board without speaking. She waited. "Ridgeline," he said finally, $2,040,000 and change. Claire capped her marker. "All paid out in increments small enough to stay below your internal review threshold. Someone understood your audit triggers." Augustus set those thresholds. "I know." Adrian stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the grid. His jaw was doing something tight and controlled that she'd started to recognize as the face he made when he was angry and had decided not to be angry out loud. "What else?" he said. "How much do you want tonight?" "All of it." She pulled her chair back and sat down. "There are at least 3 more vendors with similar profiles. I've confirmed 2 definitively. The third has cleaner paperwork, which means either it's legitimate or Augustus was more careful about that one. My instinct says the latter." She looked up at him. "The real estate angle is what concerns me more right now." "Explain." "Some of the money didn't go into accounts. It went into property purchases. Holding companies, arm's-length transactions, the kind of layering that takes 6 months to untangle if you don't know what you're looking for." She put her pen down. "Whoever was buying those properties wasn't doing it to hold them as assets. They were buying them to block you." Adrian went very still. "Block me from what?" "Your construction pipeline. I pulled the permits on 6 properties you've been trying to develop over the past 2 years. 3 of them stalled because adjacent parcels were purchased by other buyers right before your acquisition offers went in. Those buyers are connected to the same holding company network that connects back to Ridgeline." She paused. "Adrian, someone wasn't just stealing from you. They were using your own money to sabotage your legitimate business." The silence in the office lasted long enough that she could hear the forklifts moving on the floor below. "Get me names," Adrian said. "I need more time." "How much more time?" "A week. Maybe 10 days. She held his gaze. "And I need you to not do anything with those names until I've finished building the full picture. If you pull one thread before I've mapped the whole web, whoever's on the other end will know, and they'll move the money before we can document it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're telling me to wait." "I'm telling you that if you don't wait, you'll win one fight and lose the war." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. Adrian Moretti's face did not soften in any conventional sense, but something that registered briefly as surprise, like he hadn't expected to hear that sentence from her, or hadn't expected to agree with it. "1 week," he said. He left without another word. Claire turned back to the whiteboard. Her hands were steady. She noted that, and filed it away. The fight, when it came, started over nothing important. That was how it always worked. The real argument was never about the thing that started it. It was a Thursday afternoon, 10 days into her second week. Rowan had brought her a set of physical ledgers from a secondary storage facility. Older records, pre-digital, covering a period before Adrian had consolidated his operations. They were dense and badly organized, and they smelled like a basement, and Claire had been working through them for 4 hours when she found a transaction that didn't belong. It was a payment. Cash equivalent, converted through a currency exchange, issued in a series of installments over 8 months. The total amount was modest relative to everything else she'd found, $60,000. What made it stand out was the recipient code. She'd learned Adrian's internal coding system well enough by now to read it without the key. The recipient code belonged to an internal account, a personal account, hers. Or rather, the account that had been set up in her name when she joined the organization, the account into which her biweekly payments were deposited, except this transaction predated her arrival by 8 months. She walked into Adrian's office with the ledger open. He was on a call. He looked up, registered her expression, and said into the phone, "I'll call you back." He ended the call and put the phone face down on the desk. "What is this?" She put the ledger in front of him and pointed at the transaction. He looked at it. "Exactly what it looks like," he said. "It looks like someone was paying into an account in my name before I ever walked into that restaurant." "Yes." The word landed flat. No elaboration. "You knew about me," Claire said. "Before the dinner, before my father's debt." "Yes." "How long?" Adrian leaned back in his chair. He wasn't apologetic. He wasn't defensive. He was watching her with the same calm patience he'd shown at Bellarosa, which was enraging now because she understood that patience better than she had then. It wasn't kindness. It was the patience of someone who had already thought through every possible version of this conversation and had decided which one to have. "Your name came up 18 months ago," he said. "You filed a discrepancy report at Harmon Financial that flagged a manipulation pattern in one of their client portfolios. The firm buried the report. You pushed back. They fired you." Claire stared at him. "You were right about the manipulation," Adrian said. "I know because the portfolio you flagged was connected to a money movement network I'd been trying to map for 2 years. Your discrepancy report identified something 3 of my own people had missed. So you, what? Decided to collect me." "I decided to keep track of you," he said. "There's a difference." "Explain the difference." "The account was set up as a contingency. If I ever needed someone with your specific skill set and your specific record of not being paid to look the other way, I wanted the infrastructure in place to bring you on quickly." He folded his hands on the desk. "Your father's situation accelerated the timeline, but you were already on my radar." Claire put both hands on the edge of his desk and leaned forward. "You used my father's debt to get to me." "Your father's debt existed independently of anything I did. I didn't create it." "But you bought it." "I consolidated debts from 5 different creditors. His was one of them." "Did you buy it specifically because it gave you leverage over me?" He didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. "Get out," Claire said. Adrian didn't move. "Get out of your own office for 10 minutes, she said, "or I will walk out of this building and you can spend the next decade untangling Augustus Hale's books yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and walked past her to the door. He stopped in the doorframe. "The account was never meant to be a trap," he said, "and everything I've told you since you started here has been true." He walked out. Claire stood alone in his office for 8 minutes, looking at the city through his window, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she'd learned to do when her father called at 3 a.m. with another disaster that needed managing. She was furious. She was also doing math. The math was, she had been right. She had been right at Harmon Financial, and she had been fired for it, and the thing she'd found had mattered to people far above her pay grade. There was something deeply, bitterly clarifying about that, about being told, even in this way, even by this man, that her work had been real when every institution she'd trusted had told her it wasn't. That didn't make what Adrian had done acceptable, but it made it legible. When he came back 10 minutes later, she was sitting in his chair, the ledger closed, a new page of notes in front of her. If you ever manipulate a situation to control me again, she said without looking up, I will make your books disappear in ways that make what Augustus did look like a rounding error. Are we clear? A pause. Clear, Adrian said. Then sit down. I found something in the ridgeline chain that I need you to look at. He sat down on the wrong side of his own desk. Neither of them mentioned it. What Claire found in the ridgeline chain took 2 more days to fully confirm, and when she confirmed it, she sat alone in the glass office at 11 p.m. and felt the specific cold dread of understanding something you cannot unknow. The properties. The block development parcels. She'd been right about the mechanism, but wrong about the scale. It wasn't 3 properties. It was 9. Spread across 4 boroughs, accumulated over 30 months, each purchase time precisely to appear inside Adrian's acquisition window and disappear it. The entity coordinating the purchases was buried 4 layers deep in the holding company structure, but Claire had developed a facility by now for reading through Augustus's obfuscation the way a doctor reads through scar tissue, feeling for what was underneath. The entity at the center was called Paxson Group. Paxson Group had 1 active registered agent. The registered agent's name was Daniel Hale, Augustus's brother. She brought it to Adrian the next morning and watched his face do nothing at all for 30 seconds, which she now understood was more alarming than if he'd thrown something. Augustus didn't act alone, she said. No. His brother has been operating the real estate end, which means there's a second person who knows the full scope of what was stolen and where it went. Where is Daniel Hale now? I don't know. I found his name in the corporate filings. After that, she spread her hands. He's not in any database I have access to. Adrian picked up his phone. He sent 1 text. He put the phone back down. I'll know his location by tonight, he said. What are you going to do when you find him? He looked at her. Talk to him, he said. Claire had been doing this long enough now to understand the specific vocabulary Adrian used when he meant something that wasn't the word he was saying. Talk meant something that would happen in a room she would never enter and end in a way she would never ask about. I need him to confirm the Paxson Group's full asset list before you... She paused. Talk to him. How long? Give me 48 hours to build the documentation. If you move on him before I've finished, any assets he's hidden will stay hidden permanently. Adrian was quiet. 48 hours, he said. She worked through the night. The gala was Adrian's idea, and she hated it immediately. It's a children's hospital fundraiser, he said, 2 days after the Daniel Hale conversation, dropping a printed invitation on her desk like it was a memo. I attend every year. This year you're coming. I'm an accountant, Claire said. I don't do galas. You do now. Half the people in that room are connected to the organizations I'm trying to legitimize. They need to see that my financial operations are being run by someone credible. You want me as a prop. I want you as my CFO, he said, which is what you are. She looked at him across the mountain of paperwork that had become her life for the past 3 weeks. I don't have anything to wear to that kind of event. That's being handled. Excuse me? Someone will deliver appropriate options to your address tomorrow morning. He was already walking toward the door. The car leaves at 7. I didn't agree to this. He stopped in the doorway and turned around. Would you like to negotiate? He said. Because I'm genuinely happy to negotiate. I have found, working with you, that negotiations go better when both parties are at the table before a decision has been made rather than after. There was something fractionally, irritatingly self-aware in the way he said that. Fine, Claire said, but if anyone touches my financial reputation in that room, if anyone implies that I'm something other than what I am, I'll handle it. I'll handle it, she corrected. I don't need you to manage my professional image. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his expression that she couldn't entirely classify. Understood, he said. The dress that arrived the next morning was emerald silk. Claire stood in her apartment in the early light and held it up against herself and felt something complicated move through her chest. It was not a comfortable feeling, and she didn't examine it closely. She put the dress on at 6:45 and looked in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was not the person who had walked into Bellarosa in orthopedic shoes and greasy hair. She wasn't entirely sure the woman in the mirror was the same person who had walked into Adrian's warehouse 3 weeks ago with a chip on her shoulder and a healthy fear of what she'd gotten herself into. She wasn't sure, standing there, who exactly she was right now. She put on her coat and went downstairs. The gala was held in a ballroom on the 43rd floor of a midtown hotel, and it was exactly as suffocating as Claire had anticipated. A room packed with people who had all decided simultaneously to perform generosity while conducting business, which meant every conversation was happening on 2 levels at once, and you had to be fluent in both to follow either. She was fluent in both. That was the thing about spending her career inside financial institutions where the official language and the real language were never the same thing. Adrian moved through the room the way he moved through every room. Not like he owned it exactly, but like the room understood, on some structural level, that his presence had rearranged its priorities. People made space. Eye contact was offered carefully and received briefly. Nobody touched him by accident. Beside him, Claire felt the collective recalibration of attention. She had dressed like herself. That was the thing. The emerald dress and the clean hair and the good posture, that was not a disguise. That was what she looked like when she wasn't actively hiding. And the room's response to her was immediate and slightly uncomfortable. The swift male reassessment, the female evaluation, the specific social math that happened whenever someone new entered a space and the existing hierarchy had to figure out where to put them. She kept her chin level and her expression neutral and followed Adrian toward the reception tables. They were intercepted before they reached the bar. The man who stepped into their path was 50-something, red-faced with the particular flush of someone who had been drinking for approximately an hour before switching to water in anticipation of a professional event. He wore a tuxedo that fit him too tightly across the shoulders, and he smiled at Adrian with the smile of a man who believed he had social leverage he did not actually possess. "Moretti," he extended his hand. "Gerald Facette. We met at the Infrastructure Summit in March." "I remember," Adrian said, shaking it once. Facette's eyes moved to Claire with a quality that she recognized immediately and had learned over 31 years to file away without reacting to. "And this is—" Facette let the sentence hang in a way that managed to be both a question and an assessment. "Claire Ellington," Adrian said, "my chief financial officer." The shift in Facette's expression was small but complete. The male reassessment recalibrated. The social leverage he'd imagined evaporated. He looked at her differently, not with respect, not immediately, but with the specific recalculation of a man who had misread something and was trying to recover without showing it. "Impressive," he said, in a tone that made the word mean something smaller than itself. Claire looked at him steadily. "Is it?" she said. Facette laughed, the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that fills space when a man doesn't know what else to do. "I just mean a woman in that role, for an organization like Gerald." Adrian's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Miss Ellington has rebuilt my entire financial architecture from the structure up in under a month. If you'd like to discuss her qualifications, she's the right person to ask. I'd suggest doing it carefully." Facette's face went through several colors. "Of course," he said. "No offense meant." "None taken," Claire said pleasantly, which was more devastating than anything else she could have said, and all 3 of them knew it. Facette excused himself within 30 seconds. Claire watched him go. "I told you I could handle it," she said quietly. "You did," Adrian said. "I was slowing you down." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the middle distance, his jaw doing the tight thing again, but underneath it something that might, under very specific lighting conditions, be described as amusement. It was near the end of the evening, standing near the floor-length windows with the city laid out 43 stories below, that it happened. She had been adjusting the knot in his tie. She hadn't thought about it. His tie had been slightly off-center for the last 40 minutes, and it had been bothering her the way small visual disorders bother people who think in columns and precision, and she had simply reached up and fixed it without asking. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, not threatening. Gentle, even, but complete. His fingers wrapped around the bone of her wrist and stopped her hand in the air between them, and when she looked up, his eyes were close and very dark, and more honest than she had been prepared for. "Don't do that," he said. His voice was almost too low to hear over the room. She looked at his hand around her wrist, then back at his face. "Unless," he said, "you understand what it means." Her heart was doing something irregular and unprofessional. She should have said something deflecting, something functional. She should have stepped back and told him she'd been fixing his tie because a crooked tie was a distraction and they were supposed to be projecting competence, and she should have made it small and professional and safe. Instead, she stood there with his hand around her wrist and the city glittering 43 floors below and said nothing at all. He let her go. They didn't speak in the car on the way back. She sat on her side of the back seat and looked out the window, and he sat on his, and the city moved past them both, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had too much. She was still thinking about his hand around her wrist when she walked into the warehouse the next morning and found Rowan waiting for her at the top of the stairs with the specific look he wore when something had happened that required her presence before she'd had a chance to sit down. "What?" she said. "He found Daniel Hale." "Already?" "Last night." Rowan's expression didn't change. "He's here." She didn't ask where here meant. She didn't ask what here looked like for Daniel Hale this morning. She already knew that some doors, once opened, couldn't be walked back through, and that the work she was doing in this building, the honest, precise, necessary work of separating truth from fabrication, was threaded through with the reality of what happened when that truth arrived at its conclusions. She looked at Rowan. "Is he able to confirm the Paxson asset list?" she asked. "That's what Adrian wants you to come find out." She picked up her bag. She walked down the hall. She did not look back at the stairwell or the freight elevator or the gap in the chain-link fence. For the first time since she'd started counting exits, she had stopped thinking about them entirely, and she didn't know yet whether that meant she felt safe or whether it meant something had changed in her that she hadn't given permission for, something that had come in quietly, the way the most significant things always did, and had already made itself at home before she noticed it was there. The room they were using wasn't the warehouse floor, and it wasn't the glass office. It was a room Claire hadn't known existed until Rowan walked her down a concrete stairwell she'd passed every day for 3 weeks without registering, through a fire door that opened with a key she'd never been given, and into a basement space that smelled like cold metal and old water, and something else underneath both of those things that she didn't want to name. Daniel Hale was sitting in a chair at the center of the room. He was 43 years old, according to the corporate filings she'd read. He looked older right now. He was a compact man, medium height, medium build, the kind of person who had probably spent most of his life being underestimated because nothing about him announced itself. He had the same quality his brother's books had. Neat on the surface, constructed to avoid drawing attention, designed to be looked past. He had a cut above his left eye. His hands were zip-tied to the chair arms. He looked at Claire when she walked in, and what moved across his face wasn't fear exactly. It was the expression of a man who had run a specific calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't like. Adrian was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed. 2 men she recognized from the loading dock stood near the door. "She needs him to talk," Adrian said. Not to Daniel, to the room. Daniel's eyes moved back to Claire. "I'm not a weapon," Claire said quietly to Adrian, not moving. "I know what you are," Adrian said. "I need him to confirm which properties are held under Paxson's secondary filing. He won't tell me." He paused. "He might tell you." Claire looked at Daniel Hale. Daniel Hale looked back at her with eyes that had done math of their own. "You're the accountant," he said. His voice was steady, which surprised her. "The one who pulled apart Gus's system." "Yes." "How long did it take you?" "Long enough." Something moved in his expression. Not quite respect. Something adjacent to it, from a specific angle. "Gus spent 4 years building that." "I know, he was very good." She pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down across from him, close enough that she didn't have to project her voice. "Not good enough to hide the Paxson thread. That one had a seam in it." "Where?" "The registered agent filings. He used the same address format for 3 separate holding entities. Different states, same format. It's the kind of detail that doesn't register unless you're looking at all 3 simultaneously." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" he said. "A complete asset list for everything held under the Paxson structure, including the secondary shell. And if I give you that..." Claire looked at him carefully. She had no authority to promise him anything, and she wasn't going to pretend she did, because she had found, in the weeks since she'd started operating in this world, that the fastest way to lose whatever credibility she carried was to make promises outside her actual power. "I don't make deals," she said. "That's not my role. But I can tell you that everything I document becomes a legal record. And legal records create a specific kind of accountability that operates independently of anything else that happens in this room." Daniel understood what she was saying. She could see it. She was telling him, "What you tell me will exist somewhere that outlasts this conversation." She was telling him, "That might be the only protection available to you right now, and I am being honest about what it is and what it isn't." He looked at Adrian. Adrian said nothing. Daniel looked back at Claire. "There's a secondary holding entity," he said, "filed in Delaware under the name Corvin Real Estate Trust. The Paxson assets were transferred into Corvin in staged transactions across 14 months. The final transfer completed 6 weeks ago." "6 weeks ago," Claire said. "After Gus disappeared," Daniel said, "I moved everything as soon as I understood what had happened to him." Claire kept her face still. "Who else has access to the Corvin Trust?" "Just me. Now." "How many properties?" He listed them. 11 properties total, addresses and borough designations, delivered in a flat voice with the mechanical precision of a man reciting from memory something he had memorized deliberately. Claire wrote every word on the notepad she'd brought without asking if she could. When he finished, she read the list back to him. He confirmed it without hesitation. She stood. She looked at Adrian. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. She walked out of the room without looking back. She made it to the top of the concrete stairwell before she stopped moving. She stood against the wall with both hands flat on the cold concrete and breathed through her nose for 60 seconds. The fluorescent light above her buzzed with the frequency of something that needed replacing. Her notepad was in her right hand. 11 addresses. 6 weeks of deliberate asset concealment. A man in a chair with a cut above his eye. She had just done something she didn't have a clean word for. She had helped. Not with the violence, not with the chair or the zip ties or the room that smelled like cold metal. But she had been the instrument by which a man had just given up information under duress. And the fact that she'd done it with a notepad instead of anything else didn't change the underlying structure of what had happened. She pushed off the wall. She went back to her office. She documented every address with the same precision she brought to everything, because the work was still the work. And she had learned, she was still learning, that in this world, the only thing she had complete control over was the quality of what she produced. She gave the completed Corvin documentation to Adrian that evening. He read it in 4 minutes. She knew because she counted. "This is everything," he said. "That's what he told me. I've cross-referenced 3 of the addresses against public deed records, and they match. I'll verify the remaining 8 tomorrow." Adrian set the document down. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since the gala, with slightly less of whatever filter he usually maintained between his expression and his face. It was disconcerting in ways she hadn't entirely adapted to yet. "You did well," he said. "I did my job," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She picked up her bag. "I'm going home. I want to verify the remaining properties with a clear head, not at 11 o'clock at night." "The car will take you." "I can take the subway." "Claire." She stopped at the door. "Take the car," he said. It wasn't a command. It was, she searched for the right word and landed on careful. He was being careful with her in a way she hadn't expected and didn't know how to receive. She took the car sans marche. The verification of the remaining 8 Corvin properties took until noon the next day, and all 8 matched. She was printing the final confirmation report when her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered because she had learned in 3 weeks inside Adrian's world that unrecognized numbers had a habit of being more important than the ones she expected. "Claire Ellington," she said. "Claire." The voice was familiar in a way that moved through her body before her mind had finished processing it. A cascade of memory and old reflex, and something that lived underneath both of those. Something that was not love and was not hatred, and was the specific complicated residue of being someone's daughter, when that someone had never quite managed to be someone's father. "Dad," she said. The printer continued producing pages behind her. "I need to see you," he said. "Today. It's... Claire, I need to see you in person. I can't say this on the phone." "Where are you?" "Hoboken. I'm at the Marriott on Washington Street, room 412. A pause. He sounded like he'd been awake for 2 days. She knew that sound. She'd been responding to that sound her entire adult life. "Please, I know I have no right to ask, but please." She looked at the pages coming out of the printer. She should tell Adrian. She knew she should tell Adrian. She told him she was taking an extended lunch and left before he came back from whatever meeting he was in, because she knew, with the specific self-awareness of someone who is about to make a mistake and is making it anyway, that if she told him where she was going, he would find a way to stop her. And this was her father. And whatever her father had done, she was not yet the kind of person who didn't answer that call. Her father looked like he'd been compressed. That was the only way she could describe it, like someone had taken all the volume out of him. Martin Ellington had always been a big presence, loud in small rooms, generous with space and opinions, a man who filled whatever he entered. The person sitting on the edge of the hotel bed was wearing that man's face on a smaller frame. He stood when she came in. "Sit down, Dad," she said. He sat. She sat in the desk chair across from him and looked at him and waited. "I didn't know," he said. "About the contract. The one with your signature. I need you to believe me. I didn't know they were going to do that." "Who is they?" "The people I borrowed from. The third one. Not Moretti's group. There was a third creditor. A man named Facette." Something cold moved through Claire's chest. "Gerald Facette," she said. Her father stared at her. "You know him?" "I met him 4 days ago, at a gala. He said he knew Adrian." She stopped. Her brain was running a calculation she didn't want to finish. "He's a creditor. One of the ones whose debt Adrian consolidated." "No," her father said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. Facette isn't... He didn't get consolidated. His debt didn't go to Moretti. Facette pulled out of the consolidation. He kept my contract separately." The room was very quiet. "The contract with my forged signature," Claire said. "Yes." "You're telling me that the contract, the one that makes me legally responsible for your debt, is not held by Adrian Moretti?" "No," her father said. "It never was. Moretti bought 2 of my debts. The third one, the one with your name on it, Facette kept it. He specifically kept it. He wouldn't sell." Her father's hands were knotted together in his lap. "I only found out last week. Someone I know saw Facette with lawyers who specialize in debt collection enforcement. He's not planning to negotiate. He's planning to use that contract." The floor of Claire's understanding shifted entirely. Everything Adrian had told her, about holding the debt, about being able to make the contract disappear, had been true and not true simultaneously, because it had been built on a foundation that was missing its most important piece. Adrian didn't hold the contract. Adrian had never held the contract. He had told her he could make it disappear, and he had believed that, and he had been wrong, because Gerald Facette, red-faced Gerald Facette, in the too-tight tuxedo, who had called her impressive in a voice that made the word mean something lesser, had been sitting 4 days ago in the same ballroom, looking at the woman whose financial future he held, and had said nothing. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. Her father looked at the floor. "Because Facette came to see me yesterday." He swallowed. He said if I warned you, he'd call in a second contract, one I didn't know existed." He stopped. "Claire, when I signed those original loan documents, there was a package of them. I signed everything he put in front of me. I was not in a good state. I know what state you were in," Claire said. "There's a second document, signed in my name. It transfers the lien on my building, my mother's building, the one on Prospect Avenue, to Facette's holding company. If I warned you, he would file it and I'd lose the building." He finally looked at her. "I warned you anyway. I need you to know that. Whatever you think of me, I chose you over the building." Claire sat very still. She was doing the math. Not the financial math, though that was there too, spreading out in front of her in columns of liability and exposure that were going to require a different kind of reckoning than anything she'd handled in that glass office. The other math. The math of who had known what and when and what they had done or not done with the information. Adrian had told her he held the debt. Had he known about Facet's separate contract? Had he bought the other two debts knowing the third was still outstanding, or had he been operating on incomplete information? Had it been a lie, or had it been a mistake? And did the difference between those two things change anything about where she was standing right now? She didn't know. That was the most frightening thing. She had spent 3 weeks inside Adrian Moretti's operation developing a working understanding of how he thought, how he operated, what he knew and chose to share, and what he chose not to. She had built a model of him in her mind, the way she built models of complex financial systems, understanding the architecture well enough to predict where the pressure points were. And she didn't know, right now, whether he had lied to her. "I have to go," she said. "Claire, I have to go, Dad." She stood up. She put her coat on. Her hands were steady, which felt like a biological error because nothing inside her was steady at all. "The building," her father said. "He's going to file regardless. I think, when I told him I wasn't going to stay quiet, he said it didn't matter anymore. He said things were already in motion." Claire stopped at the door. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." She looked at her father, really looked at him, which she hadn't done in the 4 minutes she'd been in this room because she'd been too busy managing her own reaction to look clearly at his. He was frightened, more frightened than she'd ever seen him, and she had seen him frightened in casino parking lots and courthouse waiting rooms and hospital emergency rooms at 4 a.m. This was different. This was the fear of someone who understood they had set something in motion that was larger than anything they had previously dealt with and had no way to stop it. "Stay in this room," she said. "Don't call anyone. Don't go anywhere. Do you understand me?" "Yes." She walked out. She called Adrian from the car. He picked up before the second ring. "Where are you?" he said, and the fact that he led with that instead of anything else told her that he already knew she'd left the warehouse without telling him. "I'm on my way back. I need to talk to you." "Claire?" "Not on the phone." She looked out the window at the river as the car crossed the bridge back into Brooklyn. "When I get there." Silence. "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question. She had not expected simple from him right now. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. She hung up. Adrian was waiting at the top of the warehouse stairs. She walked past him into the glass office, put her bag on the desk, and turned around. "Gerald Facet," she said, "tell me exactly what you know about him." Adrian's expression shifted slightly. Not much, but enough. "He was one of several creditors in your father's debt network," he said. "I consolidated 2 of his outstanding contracts with me during the reorganization of 2, Claire said. "You consolidated 2. A pause. "Yes." "What about the third?" The pause this time was longer. She watched his face and read it the way she had learned to read a balance sheet, looking for the gap between what was presented and what was real. "There was a third contract," Adrian said. "Facet refused to sell it. And you didn't tell me." "I intended to. You told me you could make the debt disappear." Her voice was level. She was working very hard to keep it level because the alternative was something she had not done in front of this man and was not going to do now. "You told me you held the contract. You told me no one would collect it. I told you I would handle it. That's not the same thing, and you know it's not the same thing." She took one step toward him. "I have been working inside your organization in good faith. I have been documenting fraud, providing evidence, sitting in rooms I should never have been in, all of it on the understanding that the thing that was used to bring me here, the contract with my name on it, was in your control." "I am handling it," he said. "Facet has his own exposure." "Facet is filing," Claire said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. My father called me today. Facet is moving to enforce the contract. He has lawyers engaged. He's already started." Adrian's jaw went tight. "When did your father call?" "Today, which is why I left without telling you. I'm sorry for that. I should have told you." She stopped. What I need to know right now is whether you knew the third contract was still outstanding when you told me you could make this go away. I need you to tell me the truth, not the version that protects your position. The truth. The longest pause yet. I knew Facet hadn't sold, Adrian said. I believed I had enough leverage over his other interests to compel him to release the contract quietly. I was managing it. You were managing it without telling me. Yes. While I was here trusting you. He didn't answer that. She stood in the middle of the office they had shared for 3 weeks, surrounded by the financial architecture of his world that she had rebuilt piece by piece with her own hands, and felt the specific vertigo of discovering that the ground under your feet is not where you thought it was. She had trusted him. She had trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in years, more than she had planned to, more than was professionally defensible or personally wise. She had walked into Bellarosa trying to repel him, and had ended up here, standing in his building with his world spread out around her, feeling things she had not given herself permission to examine. And he had known about Facet the entire time. Facet was at the gala, she said. He was in that room. You introduced me to him. I didn't introduce you. You were standing beside me when he knows what I look like, Claire said. He knows I'm working for you. He knows exactly where I am every day. Something else landed in her mind with the cold weight of a key turning in a lock. He saw me. At the gala. He looked at me, and you said nothing about the contract, and he... She stopped. Was that deliberate? Did you put me in front of him deliberately to send him a message? Adrian was very still. No, he said. Can you prove that? No. She looked at him. She had become, in 3 weeks, someone who could read this man. She had built a model of how he worked and how he thought, and that model was looking back at her right now with something in his face that she believed was genuine, not managed, not strategic, not calculated. Something that looked like a man standing in front of a consequence he had not adequately predicted. That didn't fix anything. I want the full picture, she said. Everything you know about Facet's position, his other holdings, whatever leverage you thought you had over him, and why it hasn't worked. Everything, tonight. All right. And then I want to know what things already in motion means. Adrian went still in a different way. What did you say? My father said Facet told him it didn't matter that he'd warned me. He said things were already in motion. She watched Adrian's face carefully. You understand what that means. I can see that you do. Tell me. Adrian crossed to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the waterfront below. His shoulders were carrying something she hadn't seen them carry before. Facet has been connected to the Paxson structure, he said. Not as the originator, that was Augustus. But as a financial backer. He has money in 3 of the Corvin properties. The Corvin properties. The ones Daniel Hale had named in the basement room 2 days ago. The ones she had spent this morning verifying. He knows Daniel talked, Claire said. By now, yes. Which means he knows I have the full documentation. Yes. Which means the leverage he thought he had, the ability to enforce the contract quietly, without drawing attention to his connection to Paxson, is gone, Adrian said. If the Corvin documentation becomes a legal record, Facet's exposure in the fraud becomes visible. He can't use the contract quietly anymore. He has to move before I can file. The picture assembled itself with the terrible clarity of a completed audit, all the pieces she'd been looking at separately, suddenly in their correct relationship to each other. Facet wasn't just a creditor holding a contract, he was a co-conspirator in the fraud she had spent 3 weeks documenting, whose cover was disappearing as fast as she could type, and who was now operating in a closing window with a document that could destroy her life. And the thing that was already in motion, the thing her father had heard in Facet's voice, was not a legal filing. Legal filings took days. Legal filings involved paperwork and process. The thing already in motion was faster than that. She turned to face Adrian. He's not going to use the contract, she said. Adrian turned from the window. No, he said. He's not. He's going to use something else. Claire. He's going to come after the evidence. She heard her own voice finding its way to something clear and cold that she hadn't known she possessed. If the Corvin documentation disappears, He buys himself time. And if I disappear with it, the warehouse erupted. Not gradually, not with warning, all at once, the way things end when they've been building toward an end for longer than anyone was watching. The first impact hit the roof of the glass office with a sound like the world deciding to be different. And then the window in front of Adrian blew inward in a cascade of glass and pressure and noise that took the next 4 seconds and compacted them into a single continuous fact. That the thing already in motion had arrived, and it had not come through lawyers. Adrian crossed the office in a movement she would not have been able to track if she'd been trying and hit her at the shoulder, driving them both behind the reinforced desk as the second burst tore through the room above the spot where she'd been standing, and she lay on the concrete with his weight against her and the sound of automatic fire making thought impossible, and the specific knowledge, landing in her body before her mind caught up, that she was not going to walk out of this building the same person who had walked in. The second burst took out the overhead lights. The office dropped into darkness, cut only by the orange glow of the warehouse floor below filtering up through the fractured glass. And in that half-dark, Claire could hear 3 things with terrible precision. The continued percussion of automatic fire working across the building's exterior, the sound of Adrian breathing beside her, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned to treat his own body like equipment, and the sound of her own pulse, which was not controlled and not deliberate, and was doing something in her ears that made the darkness feel smaller than it was. Adrian's hand found her arm in the dark. "Stay flat," he said, right against her ear, barely a sound. She stayed flat. She heard him move. Not away from her, sideways toward the desk's edge, and she understood he was assessing the room in the dark, the way a person assesses a room they have memorized in the light. She heard a drawer open. She heard the specific mechanical sound of a weapon being checked, which she recognized now in a way she would not have recognized 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks had taught her many sounds she hadn't known before. The firing paused. That was almost worse. In the pause, she heard boots on the metal staircase at the far end of the building, more than one set, moving fast and not trying to hide it, which meant they weren't worried about what they'd find at the top. 3, Adrian said quietly. Maybe 4. How do you know? Weight distribution on the stairs. A pause. When they come through the door, I need you to move to the server room. Behind you, 8 feet, there's a handle. Steel door. You pull it, and you stay inside until I tell you otherwise. What if you can't tell me otherwise? Then you stay inside until Rowan comes. He has a code. 4 digits. You'll hear them. What's the code? He won't need to tell you. You'll recognize his voice. That's not what I... Claire. His hand closed around her wrist again. Not the way it had at the gala. Tighter than that. Tighter and more honest. 8 feet behind you. Steel door. Move when they come through. She pressed her back against the desk. She found the wall with her left hand. She started counting feet in the dark. The office door came off its frame. Not kicked. It was a frame charge, small and precise, the kind that removes a door in a single compressed second without destroying what's behind it. Claire was at 6 feet when it happened, and the concussive pressure of it hit her like a flat hand against her whole body, and she lost the count and found the wall again by feel and kept moving. The first man through the door had a light mounted on his weapon, and it swept the room in one direction, away from her, toward Adrian. What happened next took approximately 11 seconds, and she experienced all of it from 8 feet away with her back to it, feeling for the door handle with both hands. The light swung hard. A single shot. Adrian's, she could tell by now. She knew the sound of his pistol the way she knew the sound of a printer finishing a document, and the weapon light dropped. A second man came in on the left, and Adrian was already moving in the dark, which meant he was moving through a space he understood, and they didn't. And there were sounds she couldn't categorize and didn't try to. Her hand found the handle. She pulled. The steel door opened into a room barely large enough for 4 servers and a person standing sideways, and she pressed herself in and pulled the door shut behind her, and stood in complete darkness, with the servers humming against her back, and the sounds from the office coming through the steel in a muffled version of themselves that was in some ways worse than hearing them clearly. She counted her breaths. She lost count at 31. She found the number again and started over. Silence from the office. Then, 1 shot, Then, nothing. The nothing lasted 45 seconds, which was long enough for her mind to begin the specific catastrophic mathematics of what if he doesn't come. And she stopped that calculation the same way she stopped every calculation that threatened to run past its useful boundary, by returning to the facts that were verifiable. The door was steel. Rowan had a code. She was not hit. These things were true. A knock on the door. 3 hits. Pause. 1. "It's clear." Adrian's voice. She pushed the door open. The office looked like what it was. He was standing in the middle of it, gun still in his right hand, breathing with the measured effort of someone who had spent the last 60 seconds in controlled violence and was now transitioning back to controlled stillness. The weapon light from the first man's rifle was on the floor, still on, casting a thin beam across the ceiling that showed her the room in pieces. Broken glass. Upended furniture. The printer on its side, pages scattered. 3 men were on the floor. She looked at them once and looked away. Adrian looked at her. His eyes ran across her quickly. Not the way he usually looked at her, not with the careful management of how much he revealed, but with the raw, urgent scan of someone checking a person for damage. "Are you hit?" he said. "No." He exhaled. She could see blood on his left arm soaking through his shirt from a point below the shoulder, dark and spreading. She didn't say anything about it immediately, because the look on his face told her he already knew about it, and what he needed right now was not an acknowledgement of the damage, but a next step. "Facet," she said. "Yes." He knows this didn't work. He will in approximately 3 minutes. "Then we have 3 minutes. Adrian looked at her. "To do what?" "To decide what we're doing before he does." She picked the printer up off the floor. It was cracked on one corner, but the indicator light was still green. She hit print on the document that had been queued before everything went sideways. The Corvin documentation. If it's filed tonight, not tomorrow, then Facet has no window. Everything he did, everything he funded, every property he bought through Augustus's network becomes a formal legal record before he can move a single asset. Filing at this hour. "I know someone," she said. The pages were coming out of the printer. Her hands moved through them, checking order, checking completeness, the same physical check she ran on every document she produced. "A federal financial crimes unit. I filed a report with them 18 months ago about Harmon Financial. They buried it. But the agent who took my report, she didn't bury it. She just couldn't move on it without independent corroboration." She looked up. "This is independent corroboration. 11 properties, 4 years of fraud, names, amounts, transaction chains, all of it documented to an evidentiary standard." She tapped the stack of pages. "If she moves on this tonight, Facet is looking at a federal asset freeze by morning. He can't enforce a contract when his accounts are frozen." Adrian was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I've been thinking about this since I cross-referenced the second Paxson address and understood what the full picture looked like." She met his gaze. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to file it without understanding who else it would expose. Your name is in these documents. You're in the chain." "I know." "Filing this means federal eyes on your organization. I know that too. You're all right with that." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm all right with what keeps you alive," he said. The room was cold and dark and smelled like concrete and discharged weapons, and the particular metallic quality of spilled blood. And Adrian Moretti said that sentence with less ornamentation than he put into most 3-word answers, and Claire Ellington stood in it for exactly 2 seconds before she picked up her phone. The federal agent's name was Sandra Reyes, and she answered on the 3rd ring, which told Claire she was either a very light sleeper or she had never really stopped working. "Ellington," Reyes said. Her voice was the same as Claire remembered it, careful, dry, carrying a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from working inside institutions that move slower than the crimes they're supposed to stop. "It's 11:30 at night." "I have the Paxson Corvin documentation," Claire said. "Complete chain. Gerald Facet as a named co-conspirator. 11 properties, 4 years of transactions, evidentiary standard throughout." Silence. Facet, Reyes said. He's connected to a fraud network operating through Adrian Moretti's shipping organization. He's not the architect. That was a CFO named Augustus Hale, who is no longer available. But he was a significant financial backer, and he has been attempting to enforce a fraudulent contract tonight through methods that... She stopped. She looked at the three men on the floor. Through methods that are going to require a separate conversation. Where are you right now? Brooklyn waterfront. Are you safe? A pause. Temporarily, Claire said. I need everything you have in a format I can move on. Give me 90 minutes. Ellington, 90 minutes, Claire said. I'll send you a filing package that will hold up. You know I can do that. Another silence. Then, 90 minutes. After that, I'm coming to you regardless. Claire hung up. She looked at Adrian. I need your office computer, she said, the one that's still intact. And I need Rowan to get 3 of your attorneys on the phone in the next 20 minutes. Why 3? Because some of what I'm filing is going to implicate subsidiaries that are legitimately yours, and I need counsel on record confirming that your organization is cooperating with the documentation process before Reyes starts pulling threads. If you're proactive, you control the narrative. If you wait, you don't. He looked at her. You're protecting me, he said. I'm protecting the documentation, she said. That's my job. It wasn't entirely true, and both of them knew it wasn't entirely true, and neither of them said anything else about it. Quote, the next 90 minutes were the most concentrated work of Claire's professional life. She sat at the one workstation in the building that had survived the attack without damage, a secondary terminal in the loading dock supervisor's office, 2 floors below the wreckage of the glass office. And she built the filing package with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, except faster and with the specific clarity that she had learned over the past 3 weeks came to her when the stakes were high enough to eliminate everything that wasn't essential. She documented the Paxson structure. She documented the Corvin transfer. She documented Facet's financial stake in 3 specific properties using the transaction chains she'd already verified. She included the shell company network, the fake vendor history, and the ledger anomalies she'd identified in week 1. She built a timeline that a federal prosecutor could follow without specialized knowledge, cross-referenced against publicly available records so that the core of the case didn't depend entirely on documents that could be challenged as privileged. Adrian's 3 attorneys were on conference call within 25 minutes. 2 of them were clearly in bed when the call connected and were clearly not pleased about that. And none of that mattered because what Claire needed from them was narrow and specific. She needed them to draft a cooperation letter on behalf of Moretti Logistics and its affiliated entities, confirming voluntary disclosure and good faith cooperation with a federal financial crimes inquiry, timestamped before midnight. They pushed back. Both of the ones who were awake enough to push back. You're asking us to put our client on record with a federal agency without a formal immunity agreement. I'm asking you to put your client on record before your client becomes a target rather than a cooperating witness, Claire said. There's a window right now that will not exist in 4 hours. I need the letter. Silence on the line. Then one of the attorneys, the one who had been the most awake from the start, said, Give us 15 minutes. You have 12. They delivered in 11. She sent the complete package to Sandra Reyes at 1:07 a.m. Then she sat very still in the loading dock office for 30 seconds and felt the specific post-effort deflation of a body that has been running on adrenaline and has just run out of immediate tasks. Adrian came in behind her. He sat down on the metal folding chair against the wall, the one the dock supervisors used during shift changes. He sat down with the deliberate care of someone managing a significant amount of physical pain, and he didn't try to hide it, which was itself a change from the man she'd spent 3 weeks watching perform total self-containment. His left arm was wrapped now, tightly, competently, the way it gets wrapped when the person doing it knows what they're doing and is trying to stop blood loss rather than provide comfort. The improvised bandaging was already showing through at the edges. She looked at it. How bad, she said. Through and through, he said. Didn't hit bone. How do you know? I can move it. He demonstrated, which produced a tightening around his eyes that was the closest thing to a visible flinch she'd seen from him. Bone doesn't move like that when it's fractured. That's not exactly a medical opinion. No, he agreed. It's not. She should call someone. She knew she should call someone with actual medical training. She filed that as the next task and looked at him in the loading dock's fluorescent light. He looked like a man who had run out of armor, temporarily, and was deciding what to do about that. Reyes is going to want to talk to you, Claire said. I know. Your attorneys will prep you, but I need you to understand. When they ask about the internal operations, about how the fraud was structured, the level of detail you have, you're going to have to be honest about the extent of what you knew and when. The cooperation letter only protects you if the cooperation is real. I understand. Some of it is going to be uncomfortable. Most necessary things are. She looked at him. I found something else tonight, she said. Before the attack. In the Corvin filing structure. There's a dormant fourth entity, not connected to Facet, not connected to Augustus. It predates the fraud. It's in your name. Adrian went still. It's a real estate holding, she said. 12 properties, clean title, legitimately acquired. But it's been structured in a way that made it invisible to your own financial review. Augustus set up the structure. She paused. I think he was planning to transfer it, quietly, over time. Another layer of the theft that he didn't finish before you caught him. You're telling me Augustus was in the process of stealing my own legitimate assets? That's what the structure suggests. Yes. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Can you recover it? He said. Legally. Yes, it's in your name. Clean title. I can document the attempted transfer and file a protective order that locks the structure until the federal investigation resolves. She paused. It's 12 properties, Adrian. Clean and legitimate. It's actually a significant part of your construction pipeline that you didn't know you still owned. Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, something quieter than relief. The expression of a man who has been in a war long enough to forget that wars sometimes end with something other than nothing. Do it, he said. She turned back to the terminal. She had been typing for 4 minutes when her phone buzzed. Reyes. She picked up. I have the package, Reyes said. Ellington, this is substantial. I know. The Facet connection is going to need a day to verify against our existing files, but preliminary cross-reference is already showing 3 matching entities. A pause. I can move for an emergency asset freeze based on what's here, 24 hours. He has an active contract that he may try to enforce in the interim. On you? Yes. Forward me the contract. If it's connected to the fraud network, I can include it in the freeze petition. Claire closed her eyes for 1 second. I'll send it in 10 minutes, she said. She hung up. She looked at Adrian. The contract, she said. I need it. He reached into his jacket. He produced a folded document. He held it across the space between them. She took it. It was the same contract she had seen at Bellarosa the night they'd met. Her name. Her forged signature. The legal instrument her father had signed without understanding what he was building, and which had been held by Facet as a weapon he'd planned to use when everything else was finished. She photographed it on her phone and sent it to Reyes. Then she put it in her bag. Adrian watched her. What are you doing with it? He said. Keeping it, she said, until the freeze is confirmed. After that, she looked at him. After that, I want to burn it, personally. He held her gaze. That can be arranged, he said. Halket. Reyes called back at 2:40 a.m. The asset freeze petition is filed, she said. Emergency basis. Judge Farrow is reviewing tonight. She's on the financial crimes rotation, and she's fast. I expect an order within 2 hours. A pause. Facet's attorneys are going to know within minutes of the filing. He's going to move. Move how? Claire said. He's going to try to get to you before the order is signed. He's already tried that. Silence. How bad? Reyes said. Bad enough, Claire said, but we're contained. I'm sending 2 agents to your location. Don't argue with me about this. I'm not going to argue with you. She put the phone down. She looked at Adrian, who had heard enough of both sides to understand the shape of the next 2 hours. 2 federal agents are coming here, she said. I know. Is there anything in this building that shouldn't be here when they arrive? He looked at her steadily. The 3 men in the office need to go, he said. Then they need to go right now. He stood from the metal chair, moving with the controlled deliberateness of someone working around a substantial amount of pain, and picked up his phone. She turned back to the terminal. She thought about Gerald Facet, somewhere in the city right now, receiving news that his asset freeze petition had been filed. She thought about what he would do with that news. She thought about the specific kind of man who hires people to come through a door with automatic weapons. Not the dramatic kind of dangerous, not the flashy tabloid kind, but the kind who sat in a too-tight tuxedo at a charity gala and called a woman impressive in a voice that meant the opposite, and smiled at a man he was trying to destroy and said nothing. She had met men like Facet in corporate boardrooms and accounting offices and regulatory hearings. Men who committed large crimes in small voices. Men who understood that the most effective kind of violence was the kind that wore a suit and arrived through official channels. She had beaten them before with a spreadsheet and a discrepancy report. She was going to beat him again tonight with 11 properties and a federal asset freeze and 90 minutes of work that was the most honest thing she had ever done. She was still typing when the loading dock door opened and Rowan came in, and behind him, two people she didn't recognize, and behind them, Gerald Facet, pale and tightly controlled, flanked by a man in a gray suit who was clearly an attorney, and the specific stillness that descended on the room was the kind that precedes things that cannot be taken back. "Miss Ellington," Facet said. His voice was the same as she remembered from the gala. Careful, slightly warm, carrying the precise amount of social ease that money and impunity produce in men who have never been held accountable for anything. He looked at Adrian, then back at her. "I think," he said, "we should talk about what you've done tonight before this goes any further." Claire saved the document she was working on. She closed the laptop. She stood up from the chair, and she was aware, as she did, of Adrian somewhere behind her right shoulder. Not intervening, not stepping forward, simply present, the way a wall at your back is present. And she looked at Gerald Facet across the loading dock and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for so long she had almost forgotten what its absence felt like. "You're about 40 minutes too late for that conversation," she said. Facet's careful warmth shifted. "The freeze petition hasn't been approved yet," he said. "No," Claire agreed, "but it's been filed. And everything that makes it possible to approve it is already in federal hands." She tilted her head slightly. "Your attorneys can verify that. They probably already have." The man in the gray suit said something quietly into Facet's ear. Facet's face did something small and complete. The way a market does when a position moves past the point of recovery. Not collapse, not explosion, just the quiet, irrevocable settling of a number that will not go back to what it was. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "I understand exactly what I've done," Claire said. "I documented a fraud, I filed a report, I cooperated with a federal inquiry." She paused. "That's what I do." Facet looked past her at Adrian. "You let her do this," he said. Adrian said nothing. "You had a choice," Facet said. "I offered you a settlement. I offered you a quiet resolution. Everything that happened tonight, the attack on this building, the damage, none of that was my first preference. You pushed this—" "Stop," Adrian said. One word. Facet stopped. "You sent 3 men through my office with automatic weapons," Adrian said. "Don't stand in my building and tell me about your preferences." The gray-suited attorney said something again, quieter this time, with an urgency that had not been there before. Facet looked at Claire one more time. The warmth was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was not frightening in the way she might have expected. It was smaller than that, the specific diminishment of a man discovering in real time that the leverage he'd been holding has already been transferred out of his hands. "This isn't finished," he said. "Actually," Claire said, "it is." She picked up her phone. She called Reyes. "He's here," she said. "Facet, at my location." She looked at Facet. "With his attorney." Reyes said 4 words. "Don't let him leave." Claire looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at the door. Facet looked at the man in the gray suit. The gray suit looked at the floor. The loading dock was very still for a long moment, the specific stillness of a situation that has arrived at its outcome and is simply waiting for all the parties to acknowledge it. And Claire Ellington stood in the middle of it, phone in hand, the completed documentation already filed and moving through federal systems at a speed that no amount of money or leverage or men through a door could now intercept. And she felt, for the first time since her phone had rung at 11:14 a.m. on an ordinary Thursday and a voice like gravel had told her to be somewhere by 8, something that was not relief and was not triumph and was closer in its quiet cellular certainty to the feeling of a balance sheet that has finally, after weeks of searching, resolved to zero. Behind her, she heard Adrian exhale. It was the first unguarded sound she had ever heard him make. Sandra Reyes arrived at 3:18 a.m. with 2 agents and a federal order that was still warm from the printer. She was 44 years old, compact and direct, the kind of woman who had spent 2 decades inside institutions that underestimated her and had developed in response a particular economy of movement. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. She walked into the loading dock and read the room in approximately 6 seconds. Facet against the far wall with his attorney, Rowan, near the door. Adrian standing slightly apart with his left arm wrapped and his face carrying the specific flatness of a man managing significant pain while refusing to acknowledge it, and Claire at the center of everything, still standing. Reyes looked at Claire for a moment. "You look terrible," she said. "I've had a difficult night," Claire said. "I read the package you sent." Reyes held her gaze. "Ellington, this is the same network you flagged at Harmon 18 months ago. The same network, larger than I understood then. We buried your report." "Your director buried my report," Claire said. "You filed it." Something moved through Reyes's expression. Not quite guilt, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for longer than they planned to. "I filed it," she agreed. Then she turned to Facet. What happened next was not dramatic. That was what Claire would remember most clearly afterward, how undramatic it was. Reyes read Facet his rights in a flat, practiced voice. The gray-suited attorney objected twice using specific legal language that Reyes acknowledged without responding to. Facet looked at Claire once during the process, a long look that carried something she recognized as the specific hatred of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he had decided in advance was not capable of outmaneuvering him. She looked back at him without flinching. He looked away first. They walked him out through the loading dock door into the Brooklyn night, and Claire watched him go, and felt, not satisfaction, not the clean triumph she might have imagined at some earlier version of this moment, but something quieter and more complicated. The specific emotional aftermath of a very long fight that has finally ended without killing you. She became aware, slowly, that her legs were shaking, not from fear, from the basic physical fact of adrenaline leaving a body that had been running on it for 6 hours. She sat down on the metal folding chair against the wall, the one Adrian had been sitting in. It was still warm. Reyes stayed another 40 minutes. She took a preliminary statement from Claire, seated at the dock supervisor's desk with a recorder running and one of her agents taking notes. She was careful and thorough, and she asked her questions in an order that told Claire she had already read the filing package in full and had understood its architecture. She was not asking for orientation, she was asking for confirmation. Claire answered everything. She answered questions about the shell companies and the fake vendor network and the Corvin properties. She answered questions about Daniel Hale and what he had confirmed and how. She answered questions about the attack on the building, describing it in plain factual terms. The frame charge on the door, the automatic fire, the 3 men who had come through, without editorializing about what had happened to those men afterward, because that was not her documentation to provide. Reyes did not push on that. That omission was its own kind of answer, and both women understood it without naming it. Toward the end, Reyes asked, "Your involvement with Moretti's organization, you're describing it as involuntary initially, transitioning to a formal employment arrangement." "Yes." "The original coercion was the forged contract held by Facet." "Held by Facet, yes." "I was initially led to believe it was held by Moretti's organization." "That was not accurate." She paused. "Moretti held 2 of my father's debts, not the one with my name on it. When I discovered that, the situation became more complex." "Did you remain in the organization voluntarily after that discovery?" Claire considered the question with the same honesty she had brought to every answer. "Yes," she said. Reyes wrote something. "Why?" Because the work wasn't finished, Claire said, and because I had come to understand that my safety was not guaranteed outside of it. She paused again. And because what I was documenting was real fraud that had real victims, and I was the person best positioned to document it correctly. In that order? Reyes said. In that order, Claire said. Reyes capped her pen. The cooperation letter from Moretti's attorneys, she said. That was your idea. Yes. That's what keeps this case clean on our end. Reyes looked at her directly. You understand that. I understand that. It's also what limits our ability to pursue certain aspects of his organization's non-financial activities. Reyes let that sentence exist in the air between them for a moment. I assume you understood that too. I documented financial fraud, Claire said. That's what I was asked to do. That's what I did. Reyes held her gaze for 3 seconds. All right, she said. She stood, clicked off the recorder, and picked up her notes. We'll need you available for follow-up interviews. Don't leave the state without notifying us. I understand. Reyes started toward the door, then stopped. The report you filed at Harmon, she said, without turning around. The one that got you fired. It was right. The pattern you identified was real. It connected to this. She paused. I want you to know that someone knows that. Claire sat with that for a moment. It took 18 months, she said. It did, Reyes agreed. I'm sorry it did. She walked out. Adrian came to find her at 4:05 a.m. She was still in the dock supervisor's office, sitting with the lights on and a cup of coffee that had been brought to her by someone and had gone cold without her noticing. The building had that specific post-event quiet, not emptiness, but the subsidence of noise after sustained intensity, like the air after a storm has moved through. He sat down across from her. He moved like someone whose pain medication had been insufficient, which it probably had been, because she was reasonably certain he hadn't taken any. The agents are done processing the scene upstairs, he said. I know. I heard them leave. Reyes filed the full freeze order. Facette's accounts are locked. All of them, including the offshore structure. She works fast. You gave her everything she needed to work fast. She looked at her cold coffee. My father's building, she said. The Leon Facet filed. Reyes said the freeze covers it. It'll have to work through the courts, but it'll hold, Adrian said. His attorneys will know the lien was executed as coercion. They'll negotiate it out to avoid adding to his exposure. You're sure? I'm sure. She nodded once. She was aware that this was the moment when certain things needed to be said. And she was also aware that she was very tired, and that tiredness made her less precise than she preferred to be, and that precision mattered here more than almost anywhere else. You didn't tell me about Facet, she said. No. You knew the third contract was outstanding. You knew he hadn't sold it. You told me you would handle it, and you let me believe the situation was more controlled than it was. Yes. That put me in a position where I was making decisions without complete information. In this specific world, in the situation I was in, that is a dangerous thing to do to someone. I know, he said. I was wrong. She looked at him. He said it the way he said everything, once, without ornamentation, without the hedging qualifications that people usually built around difficult admissions to soften them on the way out. He said it like a fact he had already accepted and was simply reporting. Why, she said, why did I not tell you? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the waterfront, a boat horn sounded twice across the water. Because I was managing Facet through pressure on his other interests, he said, and I believed I had enough time to resolve it before it became relevant to you. And I did not want— He stopped, started again. I did not want you to understand the full scope of your exposure, because if you had understood it completely, you might have left, and I had already decided that was not something I was willing to allow. You didn't want me to have the information because the information might have led me to a choice you didn't want me to make. Yes. That's control, she said. That's the same thing my father did. A different scale, a different method, the same structure. The silence that followed was not comfortable. She had not intended it to be comfortable. She had intended it to be accurate, and it was accurate, and she watched Adrian receive it with the same stillness he received everything, not deflecting, not diminishing, not building a case for himself. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right. What do you need from me?" She looked at him across the desk in the flat fluorescent light, with his arm wrapped and his face carrying all the weight of the past 6 hours, and she thought about what she needed and separated it from what she felt, because those were two different things, and she had learned, over 31 years of managing her father's disasters and other people's numbers, and her own stubborn determination not to be smaller than the space she was in, that conflating them was how you made decisions you regretted. What she needed was honesty with a structural guarantee, not promises. Promises were cheap in every world, but especially in this one. "I need you to stop managing what I know," she said. "Everything. From here. Whatever's happening with this organization, with the federal investigation, with the remaining PACs and assets, with anything that affects my professional position or my personal safety. I need complete information in real time, not the version you've decided I can handle." "All right? That's not a small ask." "I know what it is," he said. "If you do it again, if you withhold something because you've decided the outcome of me having it, I will walk. Not from anger, not reactively. I will walk because a person cannot function with integrity inside a system where the information available to them has been pre-selected by someone else's judgment of what they ought to know." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "I understand," he said. "I need you to mean that." "I mean it." She looked at him. She had become, over the past weeks, very good at reading this man. She had built a model of how he thought and how he operated, and where his genuine edges were versus the ones he performed. The model was not complete. No model of a person was complete, and she had enough statistical literacy to know that all models were wrong and some were useful, and the best you could do was update them honestly when new information arrived. The model said he meant it. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway. They left the warehouse at 5:30 a.m. The sky over Brooklyn was doing what it does in very early morning. Not dark anymore, not light yet. A specific gray-blue that exists for approximately 20 minutes before the sun makes a decision. Claire sat in the back of the car and watched it through the window and did not think about anything in particular, which was itself unusual enough to notice. She was not calculating. She was not running assessments or building models or tracking variables. She was simply sitting in a car watching the sky get lighter, and the specific relief of not having her mind in motion was something she hadn't felt in long enough that she didn't immediately recognize it. Adrian sat on his side of the back seat. His eyes were closed, which was not something she had ever seen while he was awake. She looked at him for a moment, at the old fracture along his cheekbone, the ink along his forearm below the rolled sleeve, the set of his jaw, which was still tight, still carrying something, even in something close to rest. She looked back at the window. "Where are we going?" she said. "The penthouse," he said, eyes still closed. "You need to sleep." "I need to—" "You need to sleep," he said again. "Whatever comes next, you need sleep first." "So do I." She thought about arguing. She didn't. "All right," she said. "Oh." The penthouse was exactly as she'd seen it the one time he'd brought her there before. The dark wood, the polished concrete. The minimalism that was not stylish minimalism, but the minimalism of a man who had never had occasion to fill a space with things because he had never quite believed a space was his to fill. The sunrise was beginning to show through the east-facing windows, laying long orange lines across the floor. He went directly to the kitchen. She heard water running, the sound of a cabinet opening, the particular noise of someone taking medication they had been avoiding for several hours. She stood at the window and looked at the river and the light coming up over the buildings across the water. He came and stood beside her, not close, a foot of space between them. Just present, the way he was always present, which she had learned was its own form of something. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "The account. The one that was set up in my name before we met. You said it was a contingency, that you tracked my work at Harmon and set it up in case you needed someone with my skill set." "Yes." "Was any of it, the dinner, the way you handled the debt conversation, what you said about seeing past my disguise, was any of that calculated to bring me here?" He was quiet for a moment. "The dinner was practical," he said. "I needed to assess whether you were who your record suggested. I needed to understand how you responded to pressure." He paused. "What I said at the dinner was true. I was not performing it, but I was also not entirely separate from the objective. So it was both." "Yes." "At what point did it stop being both?" He looked at her. "The night you found the Ridgeline chain," he said. "You were still in the office at 11 o'clock, and you had been there since 7 in the morning, and you were angry at the books. Not frustrated. Angry. Like the fraud was a personal insult." Something in his voice shifted slightly. "I stood in that doorway and watched you argue with a spreadsheet, and I understood that I had made a significant miscalculation." "What miscalculation?" "That I could keep you at a professional distance." He looked back at the river. "I was wrong about that fairly early." She absorbed that. "The gala," she said. "When you put yourself between me and Facet. When you told him I was your CFO." "Yes." "Was that professional?" "No," he said. "That was not professional." The orange light was spreading across the floor between them, widening. She turned to face him. He turned to face her. She looked at him in the morning light with all the composure stripped away. Not his composure, which was structural in him, built into the architecture, but the distance he maintained between himself and whatever he actually felt, which she had been watching thin for weeks, layer by layer, until last night when it had disappeared entirely in a loading dock, when he'd said, "I'm all right with what keeps you alive," without dressing it as anything other than what it was. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask. If I stay, and I mean in this building, in this city, in whatever this is, I need to know that it's not because of the debt, or the contract, or the investigation, or any external structure that has been shaping my choices since that night at Bellarosa. I need to know that the circumstances are gone, and what's left is still something real." He looked at her with those flat, patient, honest eyes. "The contract is burned," he said. "Effectively, Facet can't touch it. The debt your father owed me, I'm writing it off. It's done. There is no outstanding obligation between us. Nothing you owe, nothing I'm owed." He held her gaze. "If you walk out of here this morning, I will not pursue it. I will not contact you. I will not send Rowan. You walk, and you walk clean. And if I stay, then you stay because you want to. No other reason." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had walked into Bellarosa in orthopedic shoes and a mustard turtleneck, smelling of raw onion, performing ugliness as a defense mechanism because she had learned so thoroughly that the world was a place where you had to make yourself smaller to survive it. She thought about the 3 weeks that had followed: the ledgers, the loading dock, the gala, the basement room, the server closet, the night she had built a federal filing package while a man she had started to love bled quietly in a chair 15 feet away. She thought about what it had cost. All of it. Her father. Her old job. Her quiet, careful life in its falling apart apartment. She thought about whether she would go back to any of it if she could. She found, honestly, that she would not. "I'm staying," she said. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her, didn't close the space between them immediately, because he was still that man, the one who waited, who was careful with things he didn't want to break. She closed the space. She put her hand against his chest, over his heart, not fixing his tie, not performing anything, just her hand on his chest, feeling the beat of a heart that had been doing what hearts do through everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. His uninjured arm came around her. He held her the way he did everything, without half measures, without performance, completely. And she stood in it and felt the specific exhaustion and specific relief of a person who has been running for a very long time and has finally, genuinely, stopped. Outside, the sun finished deciding what to do and committed to the day. 3 months later, the warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront looked different, not dramatically. The structure was the same, the loading dock and the freight elevator and the chain link fence with the gap in it that someone had finally repaired. But inside, the glass office had been rebuilt with better windows. The financial operations ran on clean software with clean data. Every corrupted ledger had been replaced. Every shell company had been dissolved or transferred to federal custody. The construction pipeline, including the 12 properties from the dormant fourth entity that Claire had recovered, was moving again under a structure that could withstand scrutiny because it was designed to. Claire's office now occupied the east corner of the upper floor. She had put a plant in it, small and unpretentious, the kind that didn't require much. She had also, without particularly intending to, accumulated a second coffee mug, a spare pair of reading glasses, and a framed photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn that she had taken herself on a morning when she'd gotten to the office before the sun. It was the first photograph she had ever framed. She noticed that one morning while she was waiting for a document to print, and she stood there looking at it long enough that Adrian came to the office door to find out what had stopped her. She pointed at it. "That's the first thing I've ever put on a wall," she said. He looked at the photograph. "How old are you?" he said. 31. "You've never put anything on a wall." "I never stayed anywhere long enough," she said. "I was always either about to leave or already planning the next place. There was no point." He looked at her. She looked at the photograph. "I wasn't planning to stay here either," she said. "In the beginning." "I know." "I had 6 different exit routes mapped by the end of week 1. "I know," he said. "Rowan told me." She turned around. "Rowan told you?" "He said you were clocking the exits every morning. Stairwell, freight elevator, the gap in the fence." Adrian's expression held something that was as close to gentle amusement as his face permitted. "He said it stopped around week 3. She looked at him. "What did you think when he told you that?" "That you were smart," he said, "and that I hoped week 3 held." She shook her head slightly, which was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. She turned back to the printer and collected her pages. The federal case against Gerald Fassett took 8 months to reach its first major hearing. Claire provided testimony twice, once in a recorded deposition and once in front of a grand jury panel in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. Both times she arrived early, sat straight, and answered every question with the same precision she brought to financial documentation. She was not nervous exactly. She was accurate, which was what she knew how to be. Fassett's attorney made 2 attempts to challenge the documentation's evidentiary validity. Both failed. The Corvin properties were frozen. 3 had already been transferred to Moretti Logistics through the court-supervised recovery process, adding them to the legitimate construction pipeline. The remaining 8 were pending, which in federal terms meant approximately another 2 years, but the outcome was not in doubt. Reyes called Claire after the grand jury session. "You did well in there," she said. "I told the truth," Claire said. "That's not the same as doing well." "In that room it is," Reyes said. They were quiet for a moment. "The Harmon case," Reyes said. "The report you filed 18 months ago. Our director has retired since then. The incoming director has been briefed on the Paxson connection. The Harmon case is being reopened." Claire sat with that. "How long were you sitting on that?" she said. "Since the freeze order was signed," Reyes said. "You could have told me sooner. I wanted to wait until the grand jury session was finished. I didn't want it to affect your testimony." "My testimony was about Fassett and Paxson. The Harmon case is connected," Reyes said. Same network, earlier iteration. Your testimony was always going to be relevant to both. I needed it clean." Claire looked out her office window at the waterfront below. "All right," she said. "Ellington." Reyes paused. "You were right 18 months ago, for what that's worth." "It's worth something," Claire said. "Thank you." She hung up and sat for a while. She had wanted, 18 months ago, for someone to tell her that what she had found was real and what she had done about it mattered. She had been fired instead, and she had spent the months between that and Bellarosa doing work she was good at for people who were not worth her capability, keeping her head down, making herself smaller, telling herself that the system did what it did, and there was no percentage in fighting it. She had been wrong about that. Not naively wrong. The system did do what it did, and the cost of fighting it was real, and she had paid it. But she had been wrong to conclude that the cost was the only part, that nothing on the other side of the cost was worth the price. She pulled up the next document in her queue and started reading. But her father called on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She almost didn't answer. She answered. He was calling from somewhere warm. She could hear it in the background noise, the quality of the air. He had, with the help of what Claire had gathered, was a fairly comprehensive set of quiet arrangements on Adrian's part, relocated to a small city in the American Southwest where he had no existing connections, no outstanding relationships with anyone who knew his name, and no casinos within a 40-mile radius. He had a job, something administrative, low stakes, the kind of thing that would not produce the adrenaline he had spent his life chasing. She had not spoken to him in 2 months. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said immediately before she could say anything. "I want you to know that first. I'm not calling because I need something." "All right," she said carefully. "I'm calling because—" He stopped. She heard him collecting himself, which was something she had rarely heard him do. Her father had always been a man who ran from silence, who filled every gap with noise or action or the next plan. The silence she was hearing on the line was new. "Because I understand what I did. All of it. The contract with your name, the years before that. The way I used you." Another pause. "I want you to know that I know what it was. Not excuses. I know what it was." Claire sat very still. "I know what it cost you," he said, "and I know I can't pay it back. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I needed you to know that I know." She looked at the framed photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge on her wall. She thought about what to say, and she thought about honesty, and about what it had cost her, and what she had found on the other side of the cost. And she thought about the fact that she was 31 years old, and her father was 63, and neither of them was going to become a different person. Exactly. People didn't work that way. The damage didn't undo itself, and the patterns didn't simply stop. But that some things, acknowledged honestly, became something other than open wounds. "I know you know," she said. "I've known for a long time that you knew. The knowing was never the problem." "I know," he said. "Stay where you are," she said. "Don't gamble. Call me on Sundays if you want. Don't call me at 3 a.m. A long pause. "All right," he said. "Thank you, Claire." She hung up. She sat for a moment, then she went back to work. In December, on a night when the city had finally committed to winter, Claire found Adrian on the penthouse roof. He went up there sometimes. She had learned this, the way she had learned most things about him, by observation rather than disclosure. When the building got too heavy with whatever he carried in it, he went up where the wind was and stood there for a while and came back when he was ready. She had never followed him before. She followed him tonight. She came through the roof access door and found him at the eastern edge, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the river. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. She came and stood beside him, close enough that their arms were touching, and looked at the same view. Manhattan across the water, the bridges, the lights. "The Harmon case is being reopened," she said. "I heard." "Reyes called. The new director has been briefed." He nodded once. They were quiet for a moment. "Augustus is dead," he said. She had suspected. She hadn't asked. "When?" she said. 3 weeks after he disappeared. Natural causes, technically. He had a cardiac condition that had been unmanaged for years. He paused. He knew about it. He kept working anyway. She thought about that. About a man who had spent 11 years building something intricate and patient and ultimately self-defeating, who had known his heart was failing and had kept moving, and what that said about the specific human capacity to commit to a direction even when the destination was obviously destruction. She didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't something that needed to be said out loud. "Daniel Hale," she said. "What happened to him?" "He's alive," Adrian said. "He's in the federal system as a cooperating witness. He'll do time, reduced, out in 3 years probably." "That's fair," she said. "Given what he provided." "Yes." They stood in the cold. Below, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent to the specific reckonings of the people inside it, indifferent to everything except its own continuous motion, which was, Claire had come to feel, one of its truest qualities and one she had learned to find steadying rather than alienating. "I want to ask you something," Adrian said. "Ask." "At Bella Rosa, that first night, if I had been who you expected, The heir, the ordinary creditor's son. Would you have run the plan? The disguise plan? Yes. Of course, she said. That was the entire point. And if it had worked, if you'd driven him off, he looked at the river. Where would you have gone after? She thought about it honestly. Back to my apartment, she said. Back to work. Back to the same life I had before. With my father's debt still accumulating somewhere I couldn't see, and my Harmon report buried and no one knowing what I'd found. She paused. Back to being careful, trying not to take up too much space. He turned to look at her. You take up exactly the right amount of space, he said. She looked at him. In the cold air, in the December dark, with the city spread out around them and 3 months of their shared history sitting in the space between who they had each been and who they were now, Adrian Moretti looked at Claire Ellington with no distance in his face at all. And she understood that for him, a man who had kept everything managed, everything controlled, everything at the exact arm's length he had decided was safe, this was the equivalent of every wall coming down at once. She reached up and fixed his collar, which was turned against the wind. She left her hand there. He put his hand over hers, not stopping her this time, just holding it there, over the pulse in his throat, the way she had put her hand over his heartbeat that morning in the penthouse, after everything had ended and before anything new had begun. You told me at Bellarosa that you were no hero, she said. I'm not. I know. She looked at him. Neither am I. I forged a cooperation structure that protected a man who runs a criminal organization from full federal exposure because it was the cleanest way to take down the people who were trying to kill me. I made that choice. Deliberately. That's survival, he said. It's also compromise, she said. I'm not pretending it isn't. I'm not going to build a story where everything I did was clean and necessary and justified. Some of it was necessary and some of it was compromise, and I'm going to have to hold both of those things for the rest of my life. He was quiet. Can you do that? He said. She thought about it. I already am, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. Something small and quiet, that she registered not in her mind but in her chest, the specific way the body registers things that matter before the mind is caught up. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. That was all. They stood like that in the cold for a while, foreheads touching, both looking at the ground, and the city went on around them and the river moved below, and neither of them spoke because the things that needed to be said had already been said. And what was left was simply the fact of being present in the same place at the same time without armor or calculation or distance. The dragon had never become a saint. He remained what he was, powerful and damaged, and fiercely protective of the things he had decided to protect, carrying a long history of violence that would not erase itself simply because he had stopped adding to it. He was not redeemed. He was not transformed. He was the same man who had sat across from her at table 7 and dismantled her disguise with patient, terrifying intelligence. He was just now the same man who had learned that the one thing his entire life had not prepared him to handle was a woman who refused to be managed. And Claire, who had spent 3 decades making herself small and careful and useful to people who took without accounting, had learned, in ledger rooms and loading docks, and a basement that smelled like cold metal, and a server closet in the dark. That precision without courage was just arithmetic, and that the truest audits were not of numbers, but of the stories people told themselves to justify who they had become. She had looked at her own story honestly. She had not liked all of it. She was going to keep going anyway. Below them, the city glittered with its usual brilliant, indifferent light. Not promises, not redemption. Just the city, being what it was, full of people making calculations about what they could afford to lose and what they couldn't live without, working the numbers until something finally balanced. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Claire's numbers balanced. She lifted her head. She looked at the river. She stayed.